Hello learners, welcome to the 22nd lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I ended by providing a brief introductory overview to the sonnet as a poetic form. I described the history of this genre in 13th century Italy, and I ended by referring to the possibilities of this genre as staging an intellectual or spiritual conflict. I quoted Paul Oppenheimer, the scholar, who described the sonnet as a window into a self in conflict. This is a very important idea, the idea of a self in conflict, and the relationship between this poetic form, which is an organization of sound, and an intellectual contest or an intellectual inquiry, which is that of a self, an individual trying to debate two opposing views, both of which appear to be persuasive, both of which appear to be correct and true, but only one can be chosen. This is a very modern dilemma, a person trying to decide between two contrary views. The sonnet is a powerful form because it allows us a musical form in which to understand an intellectual conflict. Now, it's important to note that the sonnet always consists of two parts, reflecting the structure of an intellectual conflict. The first part is generally called the proposition, in which the poet or the speaker states a puzzle or a question or a situation which doesn't make sense. There is the possibility of saying something, of resolving something, but it is not clear how exactly the solution will come. So this is the first part of the sonnet, and this is followed by a second part in which the stated puzzle is resolved, or the stated problem is restated in different terms, so that if not an exact resolution, at least we move towards a resolution. As we all know, some questions can never be answered because they are eternal questions. But the process or the value of thinking is that one can change the terms in which the question is posed. And sometimes, or in the instances of the most powerful sonnets, these eternal unanswerable questions are restated so that by the time the sonnet ends, it becomes a little bit easier to provide an answer. The speaker seems to have moved a little bit closer to a resolution, to providing an answer. So this is how the intellectual conflict is staged. Dividing the two parts, the proposition and the resolution, is something called in Latin the volta, or the turn. The turn refers to a turn in the progression of ideas. Just like there is a turn in the road, just like there's a U-turn or a sharp turn on the road, in the way the ideas progress in a sonnet, there is a sharp turn in those ideas, in the way the ideas are presented. This moment is usually identifiable. Usually one can identify the line and sometimes even the word when this volta occurs. That is, when the poet or the speaker of the sonnet changes from describing the problem to providing a resolution to the problem. So roughly speaking, a problem or question is often presented in the first section of the sonnet, and then through the pivot made by the turn, this problem or question is resolved or given a new perspective in the second part of the sonnet. Now, some further technical details of the sonnet are pertinent to note. Sonnets contain 14 lines. They are written in the iambic pentameter. Iamb refers to an arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. Pentameter refers to 5 meters. Every meter has 2 syllables. And further, there is also a restriction on the rhyme scheme. For a poem to qualify as a sonnet, not only should it have 14 lines, but it should follow either of two rhyme schemes. There is the Petrarchan rhyme scheme, which is ABBA, ABBA, followed by CDE, CDE. That is, the first two quatrains have the exact same identical rhyme scheme. And then there are the remaining 6 lines follow a different rhyme scheme, right? Sometimes the remaining 6 lines, which is called a sestet, as opposed to the octave, which is the first 8 lines. Sometimes the sestet can have a different rhyme scheme. That is, instead of a CDE, CDE, it can be simply CD, CD, CD. So, irrespective of how the last 6 lines rhyme, it is true that the first 8 lines have a different rhyme scheme from the last 6. If this scheme is followed, the sonnet qualifies as a Petrarchan sonnet. The difference between the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet is that the Shakespearean sonnet does not have the separation of the 8 and 6. It's not 8 lines followed by 6 lines of a different rhyme scheme. In fact, the Shakespearean sonnet has a structure of 3 quatrains and a couplet. That is, the first 12 lines consist of 3 quatrains. That is, 3 stanzas of 4 lines each. Each of these 3 stanzas is rhymed according to a simple ABAB, CD EF rhyme scheme, and the couplet at the end follows a simple GG rhyme scheme. So all of this can sound too complicated, but seeing a few examples of these 2 kinds of sonnets will clarify exactly how the structure of these sonnets is practiced and can be implemented, and the proof of these rhyme schemes and the different kinds of intellectual effects and capabilities they confer upon the poet can be experienced by reading and listening to examples of sonnets. Right? A few more comments on these different kinds of divisions of sound and sense. The Petrarchan and the Shakespearean sonnets divide their intellectual weight very differently. I'm using the phrase intellectual weight to describe how the progression of ideas is spread out differently across 14 lines. In the Petrarchan sonnet, there is a roughly even division between the progression of ideas. So if in the first 8 lines the problem is stated or described, the last 6 lines describe a resolution or a restatement from a different perspective of the problem. So we can call this to be a somewhat even-handed division of the intellectual weight. As opposed to this, in the Shakespearean sonnet, we get a somewhat bottom-heavy division of the intellectual weight. This is because the first 12 lines simply describe, restate, and in some ways describe the problem in an overwhelming nature, almost making it insurmountable. And then there is the last 2 lines carry a lot of intellectual weight because they describe the reversal, the twist, the turn in the progression of ideas and provide a somewhat shocking resolution. And sometimes the resolution is so shocking, it is less of a resolution and more of a surprise because what appeared to be the problem no longer does so. So the Shakespearean sonnet, from this very structure, can become a much more exciting, much more challenging, much more radical form, thereby much more suitable to the exploration of complex ideas, and therefore much more shocking and intellectually challenging as a style. But this is not to say that the Petrarchan sonnet doesn't allow for intellectual exploration. It is just that because the turn comes so late in the 14-line arrangement, it can appear or it can feel that there was a stronger shock to the reader. Now, let us begin by reading one example, a very powerful example of a Shakespearean sonnet. This is Sonnet 130 by William Shakespeare. This is a very famous one, and it's quite possible that a few viewers might have experienced, might have read or heard this recited. I'm going to read it just to give you a sense of how the sounds are arranged, and also to give a sense of how the reversal occurs in the 13th line, and which demonstrates that this is an example of a Shakespearean sonnet. Sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So it's very clear what's happening in these lines, but I'll still run through very quickly the intellectual progression, the problem, the resolution, and the reversal. The problem that the poet seems to have stated from the very beginning is that there appears to the poet a mismatch between what the poet is observing in reality, between what the poet is seeing in the person that the poet is in love with, and the expectation that the poet has cultivated from reading and listening to and experiencing several cultural narratives which describe the beauty of the beloved in certain exaggerated terms. It appears that the poet's beloved does not match up to these standards. And because of this lack of fit, the poet is wondering if in fact the fault lies with the beloved and not with the things that the poet has read. So this is the problem, and the poet seems to be stuck in this problem. The poet describes the details of this problem, exactly how and why this problem exists. The poems that the poet has read and other poets seem to describe each individual part of the beloved's person in heightened, exaggerated, superlative metaphors and images, right? Lips are red, hairs are something, roses, coral. So there are all these images from the natural world used to describe simple features of the human body. And this mismatch is troubling to the poet. After having stated 12 lines worth of mismatches between what the poet observes and what the poet feels or he should be observing, the poet states that the problem lies not with what the poet is thinking, but rather with the mistaken expectations created by other poets. This is what the line false compare means, that it is false, it is misplaced to look for such comparisons, to try and make such comparisons. The 13th line that begins with the word and yet is the volta. It indicates to the reader that now, after 12 lines of describing the problem, in the 13th line, the poet will state a resolution. The poet will describe a new perspective from which what appears to be a problem will be revealed to be not a problem, but in fact a mistake that the poet himself was making. So this is an example of a Shakespearean sonnet. Let us now move to the example of a Petrarchan sonnet. And here we return to our poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is the poem Sonnet 13 from Renaissance, and the poem is a sonnet. The first lines have been taken from this and have been used by several other writers. They've become almost like a slogan or an icon or sort of a brand name for the kind of life that Millay lived and the kind of poetry that Millay wrote. A recent biographical study by an American scholar uses the first words of this poem as its title. The first words of this poem are, "What lips my lips have kissed." It is unfortunate that several scholars have used these words to present an image of Edna St. Vincent Millay as an extremely promiscuous, somewhat flamboyant writer who moved from relationship to relationship for sport and sometimes even cynically used relationships as an excuse to write more poetry. Such an emphasis on the biographical and especially on the personal aspect of a poet's life in order to interpret their poems is not very productive, but it speaks to both the popularity of Edna St. Vincent Millay as a poet and a person that scholars feel emboldened enough to take such an approach. Anyway, let us return to this poem and let us try and understand the Petrarchan quality of this sonnet. Edna St. Vincent Millay writes, "What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know what summer sang in me. A little while that in me sings no more." So it starts with a very simple beginning. It says that I can't keep track of how many individuals I may have been intimate with. And the manner and the style of that declaration reeks of a kind of condescension, that these things are so insignificant that I can't really keep track of every individual pair of lips, right? And also the location and the cause or the context, similarly with what arms. And this seems to be the situation. The problem that the poet states is that I have done certain things, but I cannot be bothered to accept the significance or the importance of those things. And yet it seems that I must keep track of these things. There is a kind of societal pressure. There is a kind of pressure the poet feels in order to give an honest and true and full account of her affairs. But the problem is that these affairs feel so insignificant that the poet cannot really bring herself to give that account. And being unable to give that account, the poet feels that something is missing, something is lacking. So the problem that the poet is stating is that on one hand, there is a desire to give that full account. On the other hand, there is an assumption, and in fact, much more than an assumption, there is an experience and almost bodily certainty that the experience whose account she may be asked to give was itself so insignificant as to barely qualify as an experience. This is the problem, and let us track exactly how that problem is resolved. Now, since I have mentioned that this is a Petrarchan sonnet, let us try and test if that is truly a correct reading of the poem. You will recall from earlier in the same lecture that in the Petrarchan sonnet, the 14 lines are divided into two sets of 8 and 6 lines. And usually, the first 8 lines follow one particular rhyme scheme, and the last 6 lines follow a different rhyme scheme. Further, it is in the first line of the sestet, that is the 9th line of the sonnet, that we can begin to see something like a reversal, something like a change in the progression of ideas. First, let us test if the first 8 lines have a particular rhyme scheme. We can test by pronouncing the last words of each of the first 8 lines. Zwy, lane, rain, sigh, reply, pain, again, cry. Right? So it is very clearly A, B, B, A, and then it is again A, B, B, A. Now, after these first 8 lines, what do we see in the 9th line, right? We see here, thus in the winter stands the lonely tree. The word thus signifies that the line that follows is an explanation or a conclusion to what has been described earlier, right? But first, let us check whether the rhyme scheme in the sestet is different from and is consistent with the Petrarchan arrangement. There is tree, one, before, gone, me, and more. Right? So tree and me, before and more, one and gone. One and gone is an I rhyme. The words look like they rhyme even if they don't. This is a liberty that's taken by many poets. And rhyme schemes, when it comes to sonnets, are never applied in a mathematical or mechanical manner. Poets take liberties all the time with these rhyme schemes. So the sestet follows the Petrarchan rhyme scheme. Now let us look for that volta, that moment of reversal. Let us read the first 8 lines again and see if we can trace the progression and the description of a problem. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten. What arms my have lain under my head, I have forgotten. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight, right? And that the tap and sigh, and in my heart there stirs a quiet plan. So the rain that is full of ghosts tonight, it means that even though the poet has treated many past experiences as insignificant, and they are indeed insignificant, she feels a compulsion to return to that past and to account for it. Right? That is what the rain being full of ghosts means. And then listen for a reply. Right? There is a voice that is expecting a reply from the poet. Further, the poet writes, in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. So, a pain for unremembered lads. Right? There are people, individuals, whom the poet does not remember and who did something. What did they do? They would turn to the poet at midnight with a cry. Right? And having forgotten these individuals, the poet feels that maybe she was wrong, that maybe she's wrong to have forgotten them. Maybe it was fine to have treated them as insignificant, but maybe there is something to be gained from giving a full account to herself of what it is that she has truly missed or given up and moved on from. Now, the 9th line begins, thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one. Right? So suddenly there's an image of a lonely tree in winter. Right? Winter describes a time when the tree is unable to provide sustenance to the creatures who treat it as a home. Right? The tree has forgotten what birds have vanished one by one. But the tree knows its boughs are more silent than before. The tree feels that because it's winter, because she has lost leaves, and I unconsciously use the word she for the word tree because this is the poet who is describing herself as a tree in winter. The poet, the tree, both, they cannot say what loves have come and gone, right? But the poet can say for certain that summer sang in me once, and that in me sings no more, right? The poet is conscious of time having passed. And as time has passed, the poet is conscious that things have lost, that the things that existed on her existence as extensions of her body, just like trees and just like branches and leaves are extensions in summertime on a healthy, breathing tree that's in bloom, right? And there are birds that stay in those leaves, in those branches, in summertime. Because it is no longer summer, right? Because the weather has changed, because these birds no longer see any value, no longer see any possibility of sustenance or survival in the branches of this tree, because these branches are bare, they have disappeared. So it is natural for the tree to be conscious not of the birds who no longer seek sustenance from her, but only of the branches and the leaves that were once part of her and which have now disappeared. So we see, if we try to connect both of these stories, and in fact there are two stories. The first story is that of a poet being forgetful, neglecting the details of her many relationships, and feeling that out of nostalgia or out of a desire to give a true account of herself to herself, feeling a gap where that memory should have been. This is the first story. The second story is that of a tree in wintertime, remembering both the birds that used to make nests in her and the leaves that used to grow on her, and finding that she only remembers the leaves but has forgotten the birds. If you try to connect these two stories, we find that the problem which the poet had stated in the first 8 lines has been restated from a different perspective. Memory is not absolute. There is no compulsion or obligation that an individual has for remembering every personal encounter they had in the past. They have a right to filter out those memories based on what they need to sustain themselves. They also have a right to filter out or forget those experiences or those encounters with persons from whom they did not get any sustenance. So if the relationship between birds and trees are one of someone seeking sustenance and someone providing sustenance, then the tree has the right to forget those who did not provide sustenance to the tree and only took or extracted care, nourishment, and sustenance from it. So if it has been the case that the poet did not find any sustenance or care in the relationships that she had, and in each of those relationships, the only constant was that other people extracted care and sustenance from the poet, then in fact, the poet has every right to forget those relationships. And in a way, the poet revisits the personal dilemma and restates that personal dilemma by providing this metaphor of a tree remembering summer in wintertime. So we have reached the end of this lecture, and I hope that I have explained the power, the complexity, and the range that the sonnet can provide, and how one poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, very powerfully uses the Petrarchan sonnet to describe a very rich and complex set of emotions. We will continue our discussion of Edna St. Vincent Millay and focus on some other poems in the next lecture. Thank you.